Last week we started a new study on the Apostle Paul, but instead of looking at one of his books, he wrote a lot of the New Testament, we're looking at his life, thinking about what we can learn from his life, what kind of person he was. And so we're following him on his journeys. Paul was a man who didn't sit still. Now last week we talked about his conversion, the Damascus Road experience. And we didn't quite wrap that up. There was actually one important part I wanted to come back to. And I made the case last week that you can kind of call it a conversion, but there's a sense in which he's not converted. Does anyone remember what we were talking about then? Conversion, but it's not a conversion? We talked about how for Paul on the Damascus Road, it was a conversion, but it was also not a conversion. So it's not a conversion in the sense that he was Jewish and then he became Christian. It's not that simple. Because a lot of his religious life stayed the same. He still worshiped the same God. He still read the same Bible. He still went to the temple. He still observed the Sabbath day and probably the rest of the law. So his Jewish life remained constant. He didn't change out of Judaism. But when he saw Jesus was Lord, which he does on that Damascus Road, what does change for him? We talked a lot about this. He stopped persecuting, that's right. What he saw in Jesus was a different way of being religious, which doesn't involve violence. So his conversion was away from force, away from violence. He came to see Jesus as the suffering Savior, the suffering Messiah. So not one that harms, but one that suffers instead of hurting others. Which means he had to change his own life because he was hurting other people to try to bring them in line. So the conversion was a conversion to Jesus, yes, but a conversion to Jesus' way of nonviolence, more specifically. Now there's one other piece of this that we didn't get to last week, and that's what I want to start with. So let's start in Galatians 1, and we're going to spend today in Galatians 1 and Acts 9 and 11. So let's look at how Paul himself described this. All right, so I'm going to flip over to Galatians 1. We read this last week, but we'll just read it again. Someone read verse 15 and 16. Randall, we got to get in line here. Galatians 1, 15 and 16. You got it, Justin? Yeah.
But when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me to his grace, to reveal his Son to me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not mean to confer with flesh and blood.
No, that's good. We'll hit 17 in a minute. Thanks. Okay. So there's some language here which we should pay attention to. Now we hear his mission. He's called to do what? Preach the gospel, but to a special group of people. To who?
Non-Jewish.
The non-Jewish people, the Gentiles, yes. So that's his mission. We hear about that in Acts as well. But the thing that I want you to note is, when did God call him, or when did God set him apart? From his mother's womb. Now that is interesting language. He's not saying on the Damascus Road I got set apart. He's saying I was always destined to do this. God had set me apart before I was born. Now, this is not the first time in the Bible we hear this language. Look back at Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah was one of the Hebrew prophets. Got one of the longer books in the Old Testament. Look at verse 5 specifically. Jeremiah 1 verse 5. Somebody read that one. Say it louder, Howard. Say it loud. Do you hear any similarities to Galatians 1:15 and Jeremiah 1:5? While you're in the womb, I set you apart. Even the mission's the same, right? It says to be a prophet to the nations. Nations is the Gentiles. So why do you think Paul's using the language of Jeremiah? We can also read Isaiah 49. Isaiah uses the same language. You set me apart in my mother's womb. What do you think Paul's wanting us to think about when he uses this language?
I think what Paul was sent is, he was set by God to be a special messenger.
Yeah, but why is he using the language of Jeremiah and Isaiah specifically? Same wording even. Yeah, it's going to spread knowledge, but what does Paul want us to think about himself? And maybe how did Paul think about himself?
That it had been done before, because you have to because Paul had a reputation.
Yeah.
So he had to set himself apart, and hey, this is not the first time God has done this, and he's done it again. I know that's not probably what you're reaching for, but it's still important.
Yeah, but who does Paul think he is? Yes. And what does Paul want us to think he is? A new Jeremiah, a new Isaiah. That's why he writes that in his letter. And everyone who's read, all the Jewish people that read his letter would have known, oh, Paul thinks he's a prophet. Paul thinks he's a new Isaiah or a new Jeremiah, sent to preach to the nations, to the Gentiles. So we can think about what happens to Paul on that Jericho road or the Damascus road, as there is a sense that there's a conversion. His life is turning around towards the way of Jesus. But we can also understand it as his prophetic calling. God calls him and sends him on a mission, just like he called Jeremiah and Isaiah and all the rest of his prophets. So Paul wants us to see him in that mold as an Old Testament prophet. Yeah, right.
Hey, what is the difference between an apostle and a disciple? What's the difference?
Yeah, so a disciple is anyone who follows Jesus. It just literally means a learner. Someone who's learning the way of Jesus, right? So we're all disciples. But an apostle is someone who's sent out on a mission. That's what the word, it's the same word as post office, apostle. Post office, apostle. It means
to be sent back or when you sent out.
Yeah, so those are disciples who are sent out in a special way on a mission.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any comments or thoughts, both this conversion and a call? Paul is a prophet. He doesn't ever come out and just say, I'm a prophet. But when he uses the same language as the prophets, we need to make the connection. Okay. What is the first? What do you think, Justin?
I was just thinking, using that language too, how to resonate with Jewish listeners.
Right.
That it's not just a separate thing, but a continuation of.
Yeah.
The Jewish promise from God.
What would his audience have thought about this? Same thing you might think if I came in and said, I'm the new Apostle Paul. One, you might think I'm full of it. But you might think, no, the apostles are done. They were in the first century. We don't have them anymore. They thought the prophets were done. They thought the prophets had stopped speaking 400 years before this. And here Paul comes along and says, well, actually, God's Spirit filled me and I'm a new prophet. He was very controversial. And this would have even been offensive to a lot of people, scandalous. And we'll see, Paul's whole ministry is going to be characterized by controversy, scandal. A lot of it he brings on himself. Okay, what's the first thing he does with this new calling? does exactly what he's called to do. He goes and he preaches to the Gentiles. Someone still got your finger in Galatians 1. Justin just read 15 and 16. If someone will read Galatians 1:17, that'll move us along.
I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later I returned to Damascus.
Good. So, I got you a map up here. Maybe this one's easier to see. So, Damascus is the one with a star on it. This is, of course, the Middle East. We're probably going to be hearing a lot more about this because we just started a war over here again. Yeah, so pray for peace. We want to pray for peace. Damascus is in what's now the country of Syria. Now, they didn't have these same lines back then, right? The countries looked different. They were divided up different. But it's now Syria. You can see where Israel is, kind of south of it. Damascus would have been a pretty good piece north of Jerusalem and the Galilee where Jesus was from and all that, right? So, where does Paul say he starts his mission? Where's the first place he goes? Arabia. Now, you might be thinking Saudi Arabia, because that's what we think of when we hear Arabia. But was that the same as Arabia in the first century? No. Because they drew the lines differently and they had different names for things. So what they call Arabia was the ancient kingdom of Nabatea. And you can see it's actually the modern country of Jordan. So, what they call Arabia is what we call today Jordan. And Jordan butts right up against Israel, modern Israel. It touches up on Syria, right? So, the top of that red line is about where Damascus is. Where did Paul go on this mission? Well, the only information we get is what you just read. He says, I went to Arabia. We know hardly anything. And you'll find out we know more about Paul than anyone, and we know very little about Paul. We have to put together his life story. We have to reconstruct it. And we're missing a lot of puzzle pieces. So what would be the most likely thing that he did? Well, most likely is he went up and down this major highway. It's like I-65. Okay? It was called the King's Highway. And it went from Damascus down all the way to the top of the sea, or the Dead Sea. And it was a trade route. Now, why might Paul have worked along a trade route? What's his background? We talked about this last week. What's he do? He works in canvas, sail, right? Awnings. Probably what tent making mostly did was make awnings. He's a business guy. And so where does he go? He goes along the business route. And probably what's he doing as he goes down this road? He'll stop somewhere and do what? He'll set up shop, probably in a market, and he'll sew some canvas, sell some awnings, some sails, some tents. And what's he going to do while he's sitting there in the market sewing? And I don't know what all you got to do to make awnings, but it's like a barber shop though, right? The barber sits there and cuts hair, but what's the barber also doing while he's sitting there cutting hair? Talking about what? A barber's going to be talking about the weather, sports, whatever's going on in the neighborhood, I don't know. But what's Paul talking about when he's sitting there sewing? Somebody comes up to buy an awning, and they sit around and they chat. Because it's a marketplace, right? People are wandering around all the time. Yeah. So he just chats. He makes conversation. This is how Paul's whole ministry is going to work He's going to go to a city. He's going to rent a stall in the market. He's going to get out his cloth. And he's going to sit there probably 5 days, 6 days a week and just do his work. But it's a place where people are always coming and going. So he can chat with people. And we know what he's going to chat about. He probably also talks about the weather and sports. But he's going to tell them the gospel. So, most likely, again, we're putting this together. When he says he went to Arabia, it means he goes through this area. Now, it's on the other side of the red line that you see Israel. That's the nation of Israel. Between the red line and the blue, which is the Mediterranean Sea. So what country is Paul in? He's not in Jewish country. He's in Gentile country. We can go a little further here because he's probably not talking to people that have never heard of God or never heard of the Bible. He's probably talking to non-Jewish people who are interested in Judaism already. And we know there's a lot of people out there, because we read about them in the New Testament, they're called God-fearers. Anybody know who the most famous God-fearer is? God-fearing Gentile? He's in Acts 10. Close. Nicodemus is a Jew. This is a Roman centurion. Cornelius was called a God-fearer. He's a Gentile, but he knows who God is. He respects God. He gives money to the poor. He prays. Okay? There's a lot of people like that out there that are interested in Judaism, but they're not going all the way. So probably as Paul is making his way through Arabia, that's who he's making contact with. Not Jews, but Gentiles who are already interested. That's probably where he'll start many of his missions after this as well. So, how long does this last? He's probably converted in about the year 34. That's within a few years of Jesus' death, okay? So Paul's a very early convert. He's probably up and down this road about 2 years. Now, where do we get this date of 36 from? Turn over to Acts 9. Okay, yeah, here's where we hear about this. So verse 9, Acts 9:19, after he's baptized, it says he spent some days with the disciples in Damascus. We already saw that. Verse 20, he preaches in the synagogues. Okay. Verse 22, he confounded the Jews who dwelt in Damascus, proving that Jesus is the Christ. So he's going to Jewish houses of worship, but again, he's a controversial figure because he says, the way we were doing things is not the right way. I follow Jesus now, and the way of Jesus is different from what we were doing before. So he's upsetting people. What's upsetting? He's probably asking some questions that people don't want asked. Questions about the way things have been done. Questions about God's will, about the law, about non-Jewish people and their relationship to the synagogue. Maybe an example would be something like immigration. Okay, it's a hot topic in our world. Jews had pretty close communities, right? Pretty tight communities. And Paul's saying, well, we should let other people in. And they don't have to go through the same processes. Just let them in. These Gentiles, let's just let them in. God wants them to be part. That's kind of like our immigration debate, right? There's some people who say, we got to be strict, we got to keep the walls up, we got to keep it bounded. And then you got some people that say, just imagine how controversial. No walls, no borders, just let everybody in. You don't have to go through the naturalization process. You don't have to swear allegiance. That would be very controversial. in our political world, that's exactly what Paul's doing in the synagogue. He's saying, let's take those walls down. Let's remove those borders. Let's just let people in because they're God's children too. So he stirs people up and gets people upset in Damascus, and he has to leave. Now we're to Acts 9:23. The Jews plotted to kill him. You see how controversial he was. And what happened? Somebody read 24 and 25. So here's where we start to get the cloak and dagger stuff. Acts 9:24 and 25.
But Saul learned of their pain. They not
They're plotting.
Day and night we kept close, watch on the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall.
They want to kill him, so they're actually standing at the doors of the city, the gates. And he said, when he comes through, we're going to grab him, we're going to ambush him. So what does Paul have to do to get out of Damascus? What? In a basket. Just imagine he's up on the wall, the city wall. Put him over in a wicker basket, like a laundry basket. Lower him down, and under the cover of night. Paul makes being a Christian seem exciting, right? It's like a spy novel. So these. It says Jesus wants everyone to be God wants everyone to be part of his community, part of his kingdom. We're going to take these barriers down. It would have sounded very progressive. It would have sounded, it just would have sounded unbiblical to the Jewish people. And so when he comes back to Damascus at the end, they try to kill him. Which is ironic, right? Because why did Paul come to Damascus in the first place? Why did he go to Damascus to begin with? What was his goal? He was going to persecute these same people who were saying God's love is bigger than we thought it was. Persecuted. He switched teams. And now he's on the other side of the persecution. What he thought was wrong up until then, he now thinks is right. And he is now going to be persecuted. But notice, he doesn't persecute them back. He's not saying, I'll kill you instead, because you're wrong. He just escapes in a basket at night. Okay. Any thoughts or comments about this little phase in his life? In Galatians, he said, I didn't talk to any human. I didn't confer with any human. So at this point, all he has is this mystical vision. He's not talked to anybody who actually knew Jesus yet. Which is a little surprising for 2 years. He's going on fumes, really.
They ran into somebody.
Okay. After he escapes from Damascus by the hair of his chinny chin, he does go and talk to people who knew Jesus. He goes down to Jerusalem. So look back at Galatians 1, 18 and 19, 18 through 21. Someone read that one for me. Galatians 1, 18 to 21.
Then after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem. And what I write to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Yeah. So he says here after 3 years, but this is probably the 2+ years he's in Damascus and on the road, right? rounds up, 2.5 years, something like that. He goes down. This is probably in the year 36. And he goes down for a short visit. And who does he meet in Jerusalem? Peter and James, the Lord's brother. Yeah. What did they talk about? Jesus, probably. Peter and James actually knew him. They lived with him. James grew up with him. Paul only saw him in a dream, in a vision. What do you think Peter and James thought when they first got the email from Paul, hey, I'm coming for a visit?
I wonder if they have actually heard through that, because, I mean, news traveled.
Yeah.
So I'm surely they had heard. We don't know, but you would think they would have heard that this Saul, now Paul, that's preaching to the Greeks.
But what's the last thing that they knew for sure about him? I mean, what's the last thing he did in Jerusalem?
Kill Christians.
He was killing them, yeah. And then he disappears for a few years, and maybe they hear rumors, because Damascus is pretty far away. Maybe they get some news. But remember, Paul said, I didn't talk to anybody. So he's a solo operator. It's just radio silence for 2 years. And then this guy says, hey, I'm coming to visit. And you got to think, if Peter and James were smart, they would have locked the door and turned off the lights.
You got to wonder if they maybe had some people hanging around.
Right. But Peter and James, you see, had already been converted to the way of Jesus. They weren't worried about their life. They know the way of Christ is the way of suffering. And they were not afraid. They may have had concerns. But they agreed to meet with him, to their credit. They didn't run away. What would have happened if the early Christians had used violence? What would have happened if they said, we got to protect ourselves from the persecutors? What would have happened if they had shot the Apostle Paul because they felt he was a persecutor? Where would we be? This is the way of Jesus, right? We don't act defensively. We don't use force. We don't use violence. But we welcome, and sometimes we suffer for it. Okay. He goes for this short visit, talks to the apostles, probably about Jesus. We don't know. This is the last time he'll visit Jerusalem for 13 years. He'll come back, but it's 13 years later. So I call it the first Jerusalem visit. That means we'll come back to Jerusalem later. Remember, though, Paul spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. He had family there. His sister lived there. Paul went to college down there. So he had a lot of connections to Jerusalem. It was almost a home base for him. But he's only there for 2 weeks. Why? Well, there's a bounty on his head. People want to kill him. He's kind of laying low. And he keeps moving. So where's the next place that he goes? You just read it. He ends up in the last verse, 21. Cilicia, yeah. Now, I don't expect you guys to know these places. They're not even called that anymore. But Cilicia is right up there in the corner. You see Turkey and Syria. You see where it makes a right angle? Cilicia is right there in that corner. And does anyone have any idea why Cilicia would have been important for Paul? I don't expect you to. Well, the town of Tarsus is the capital of Cilicia. And does anyone know why Tarsus is important for Paul? It's where he's from. It's where his mom lives. He's gone back home. We know Paul has a mission to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So he goes back to Tarsus, which is a Gentile city. Why do you think he goes back there?
Didn't you just say it was from, was his home?
Tarsus was, yeah. So he goes home. It must have seemed like this ministry was a disaster. So maybe he goes home to collect himself. Maybe he goes home to figure things out. Or maybe he goes home because, I don't know if this example works for you guys, works for my college students. You probably never had to sell Girl Scout cookies. I didn't either. Candace sold a lot of Girl Scout cookies. Candace, if you want to sell a lot of cookies, weren't you like an award-winning Girl Scout cookie seller?
Yes.
Right here. Yeah. Presence of greatness. Where do you start selling cookies? Who do you start with?
Your family.
You start with your family when you want to sell something. Where do you think Paul goes to start his ministry after it's not working out so well in Jerusalem and Damascus? I think he probably went home because that is an easy place to start with the people that you know, with your networks. We're going to see this over and over again. Paul is a relational person, and he's going to move along relational networks. So he's going to go to the people that he has connections to, and it's going to widen out from there. Where do we start with this stuff? With those who are close to us, with those who are nearby. We think of Paul as an apostle or a missionary going somewhere, but in this case, he's just going home. And he's starting at home.
And that would be with family members, I would think, because when you first said that, I thought, a prophet has no honor in his own land. And that is an issue unless you've got a supporting cast, which your family would be.
Could be.
And your family's established in that area. Mm-hmm. They're going out and they're saying, hey, I know this is going to be tough for you to swallow.
Yeah.
But my son Paul or my brother Paul or whoever's related to it, nephew, whatever, he's converted and he's in this state.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, he's been away from home for a long time. I mean, many years he's not been back here, as far as we can tell. So people may not remember a lot about him. Maybe they'd be open to hearing him in a new way. Is he successful in his hometown? We actually don't hear anything about it. It's important to remember that probably Paul failed a lot more than he succeeded. He failed a lot more than he succeeded, which is going to be true for any of us trying something new.
What do you mean that he failed? Does that mean he wasn't not converting people?
Yeah. The message didn't go anywhere there. He didn't start a church. We don't hear about the church of Tarsus, right? So, he may not have got any traction with his family. Jesus didn't get any traction with his own family for a while. So, again, we don't know. We get these little lines, and we have to put together whole years of Paul's life, right? So we're just trying to think through it. But I think that the process of this, and you can correct me, helps us understand Paul and think of him as a human being like us. What would we do in that situation? Where would we go? What kind of people would we talk to? If we had gotten this dramatic vision, go, be my agent to the Gentiles.
I believe I will tell my family because if I feel like I've been in error all this time, then I know my family was in error. So
Well, that's right.
So if I got hit with this truth in my family, they might be one of the first ones I won't let know. They just like when the storm was coming and somebody else said it wasn't. But I had this found truth that was really covered. I want to go on my family and them first.
Yeah, that's right.
I probably go back there.
Yeah. Now, I will say this, Randall. I think you're right about that. I think you're right. And we're going to end after this. Paul is less concerned with correcting Jewish people. He's less concerned with saying, hey, you're wrong, than he is with telling good news to Gentile people. He, by and large, is going to say the Jews are okay. They're following God. He's more concerned with spreading good news to Gentile people than to correcting Jewish people. In fact, the main thing he corrects is you need to let these people in. But all the other stuff he's not as concerned about as it is, this is good news for the Gentiles. All right. Thanks, guys. Good engagement. We're going to start with Paul's buddy, Barnabas, next time, who comes and fetches him from his mom's basement and gets him back on track and with a successful mission. So we'll start with the Antioch mission next time.